This meeting is being recorded.
All right, everyone. So welcome to our Cancer Bridges General Weekly Meeting. This evening, we are blessed enough to have Ellen Stafford with us. She is one of our own Cancer Bridge contractors, and she is a certified teacher of the Alexander Technique, living and working in the Squirrel Hill area of Pittsburgh. So she's nice and centrally located for all of you guys, which is nice to know. She received her certification from the Urbana Center for the Alexander Technique in the spring of 2011, where she trained with third generation teachers Joan and Alex Murray. The Murrays are best known for introducing the developmental movement work of Australian anthropologist Raymond A. Dart into their teaching style. And developmental movement consequently plays a large part in Ms. Stafford's teaching style as well. She's been known to ogle over babies, just learning to crawl, and marvel aloud at their wonderful use. I love that. And she just shared with me she has a daughter, so she's experienced in that baby field for sure. So that being said, Ellen, welcome. We're glad to have you.
Thank you. It's great to be back. So most of what I was going to say to introduce myself was already covered there. I'm Ellen. I'm the Alexander teacher. I have been volunteering with what's now Cancer Bridges since it was Gilda's clubhouse way back, and giving workshops and things like that. And now that we're back in person, I'm doing some independent, some one-on-one lessons. So you can sign up for those. There's very limited slots and they go fast. But if you're interested, you can always sign up on the calendar. So yes, little intro to myself. I am a dancer and choreographer. I have a bachelor's of fine arts in dance from the University of Illinois, which is located in Urbana-Champaign, which is where I was introduced to the Alexander Technique through the dance department. By the time I had graduated with my BFA, I knew that the technique was something I wanted to be able to share with other people. It changed my dancing and improved my own abilities enough that I wanted to share it. And so I joined the teacher training program that was in Urbana right out of college. As you heard from the bio, my teachers, Joan and Alex Murray, are known for kind of fusing Alexander Technique's work with Raymond Dart's developmental movement work, which is all about kind of the natural ways that babies learn to roll over, to crawl, to stand, to walk, that kind of thing. And so a lot of the principles are kind of conducive, complementary to each other. So the work that we do as Murray trained teachers kind of fuses those two things. But I'll go ahead and start by telling you the story of how the Alexander Technique was developed. So Alexander Technique was developed by a man named Frederick Matthias Alexander. We call him FM for short. He was an Australian. He lived in the second half of the 1800s, first half of the 1900s. And he was an actor. He was a reciter specifically. Back at that time, there was this type of performance that we don't really do anymore, which was Shakespearean reciting. So it was solo performances. He would go up on stage and he would give these very sort of ham-fisted oratories of soliloquies from Shakespeare as a solo performer. And that's what he did. And he was moderately successful at that until he started to lose his voice during performances, but only during performances, not when he was just speaking normally. And it confused him. He went to a lot of different doctors. None of them could figure out what was wrong with him. They all just said, rest your voice. Don't say anything for 2 weeks before this big performance. Which he did. He had a big, important performance coming up, and his doctor said, don't say anything at all for 2 weeks before the performance. And he did that, and he lost his voice halfway through. And so he went back to his doctor and he said, okay, this only happens when I'm performing. This doesn't happen when I'm just speaking normally. So doesn't it make sense to assume that it's something I'm doing with myself, with my voice, with some part of me when I go to perform that is causing my hoarseness. And the doctor said, yeah, that seems reasonable. And Alexander said, well, can you tell me what it is I'm doing so I can stop doing it? And the doctor said no. So Alexander decided, all right, he had to figure it out for himself. So he spent a long time, decades, by some accounts, in front of three-way mirrors, watching himself when he went to speak, when he went to recite, watching the ways that the intention that he had was changing the physicality of what was going on. And he eventually developed this technique, which at first is kind of a set of principles, of philosophies about the way that our intention and the way that our body, mind and body is connected. And so at first he started giving lessons, having people come in, and he developed this way of using his hands to kind of communicate this stuff to other people. So he had people come in and he would sort of fix them. And then eventually he started teaching other people how to teach the work. People expressed interest in being able to do it themselves for other people. And so that turned into the technique that we have today. And as I said, that one of the things I love the most about the technique is that it is kind of equal parts philosophy and practice. So Alexander wrote 4 books about the technique, about these philosophy and principles of the way that our mind and our body are connected, and the nature of habit, and the nature of making change and establishing, more efficient ways of being. And then all of these principles have actual tangible ways that we can practice them in a lesson. And that's where the one-on-one hands-on Alexander lessons come in. So a lot of what I'm going to go through today is kind of a basic overview of a few of his principles. He has a lot more than I can cover in half an hour, and they're all kind of interrelated. So it's difficult to start talking about it without immediately talking about everything else. So I'm going to try to sort of confine my discussion to a few of the biggest principles behind the technique. The main kind of focal point of the technique is the idea that use affects functioning. Basically, how we use our bodies directly affects how well they function. And when you say that, it sounds pretty obvious. But the caveat to that is that 85 to 95% of everything that we do with our bodies, we are completely unaware of. It is subconscious, it is habitual, it is just built up over time. And those things are having an effect on how well our bodies are able to function just as much. And so the idea behind the technique is to find out what all of those little things are, what all of those little habits that you may have built up over time that might be interfering with your ability to sort of function at peak efficiency, if you want to think about it that way. I should probably define at the outset for you a couple of things, because you'll hear me use these words a lot. The first one is the word self. So Alexander, one of his main points is the idea that the mind and the body are connected, and they are so inextricably linked that we shouldn't even really be thinking about them separately, that nothing we do is entirely mental or entirely physical. There's always a little bit of both in everything. Even if you're sitting and reading a book, there's a physicality to how you're sitting. If you are running, there's a mental capacity to that. Everything is on this spectrum, and nothing is entirely one or entirely the other. And so Alexander, in his books, he was a philosopher, he was not a writer. His books are full of clunky language, very hard to get into for new people. He does that thing where like the whole paragraph is one sentence and it's like subclauses upon subclauses. So he's often known to describe things in very convoluted ways that actually have much simpler descriptions. So some of the time as we're going through, you'll hear me say what he calls it and then define it much more simply for you. And in this case, Alexander never used the word self. Alexander refers to it as your psychophysical organism. because again, there's the idea of like, there's the psychological part, there's the physical part, and you are the combination of the two. A lot of this is his first group of teacher trainees didn't have the patience to say that. So they started just saying self as kind of a shorthand for your mind and your body all working together. So if you hear me talk about the self or the use of the self, that's something that you'll hear a lot as well. That refers to just sort of holistically, how well are you functioning as a psychophysical organism? So that's that one out of the way. The other thing that we're going to talk about a lot that I should define here is the word habit, because the technique, when you get right down to it, is about being able to have the option of changing your habits. But for Alexander, a habit is a very specific thing. A habit is a conditioned response to a stimulus. So you have some kind of stimulus that comes in and your body reacts to it, yourself reacts to it. You have the same stimulus come in often enough and yourself kind of just decides on, this is the way I always react to this thing. And it may be doing that subconsciously, and it may not be making the best choices in figuring out how you're responding to this. And so it's important to highlight that for Alexander, habits are not necessarily bad. We have this conception in society, I think, a lot of times to think of, oh, bad habits. But a habit in and of itself is just a shortcut. If you had to consciously control every response you have to every single thing all day long, you would be exhausted all the time. You just can't. Your body needs shortcuts. And that's what habits are. The problem comes in when you develop a habit and you're not aware that you've developed the habit, or you develop a habit that isn't beneficial to you in some way or is detrimental to you in some way. And so the idea behind the technique is to find where those things are that are, we like to use the term getting in your own way a lot of the time. So, if you have a habit that you've built up subconsciously or, without really thinking through whether it's the best way to approach a situation, it might be holding you back. And if we can get rid of the habit and take it back to a place where you now have the choice to decide how you want to react to something. So that's the idea. And the basic kind of big picture, what our goal is for Alexander Technique is to get you to a place where you can take any of those habits that you may have that are not serving you and be able to prevent them from kicking in and then replace them with more beneficial ones. So again, that's all big picture. In terms of how we actually go about doing that in a lesson, it's an individual thing. The technique is designed to be taught one-on-one, and a lot of that is because the journey is very individual to the person. But broadly speaking, I'm generally looking at a 3-step process in a lesson with a student, or a sequence of lessons, really. It's a much long-term thing. The first step is awareness, because you can't change a habit if you don't know it's there. So when new students come to me, the first few sessions are all about expanding your awareness of what's going on in yourself and also externally. A lot of us kind of tune out a whole lot of stuff. And again, it's a shortcut. Some of that is worth tuning out, but if you're always doing it, you might miss things. So opening up your awareness of exactly how you are responding to things, how you are moving, what your particular little habits and idiosyncrasies are. And it's important in this process to remember that this is a no judgment zone. So there's no such thing in a lesson with me as right or wrong, as good or bad. Everything is just different. We are showing you all the options. In particular, this goes to a principle that we'll talk about a little bit more later, which is that whatever is normal for you, whatever is your habit, is what feels right. And so if you want to do anything other than that, it's going to feel wrong for a while. So we try to stay away from the judgment and say, yeah, this might feel weird or off, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. That just means it's not what you're used to. And that's going to make it feel like that. So the first step is that awareness of opening up, seeing what all the possibilities are and seeing where you tend to fall within that. Then the second step is something called inhibition. This is another Alexander vocab word that he uses in a way that is maybe not what most people would think of. Inhibition, a lot of times people will think that that goes kind of in a suppressive direction, which is not the intention. When Alexander talks about inhibition, what he's really talking about is the ability to stop and think before you react to something. And it doesn't have to be a big stop. It's, it could be half a second, but just kind of like stopping to acknowledge the fact that you are about to make a decision and then make a decision. And what this does is it turns what was that subconscious habit into a conscious decision. So one of the examples that I often give is, look for something that we all do a million times a day. So we'll say, okay, sitting down in a chair. I want you to notice every time you sit down in a chair. Right? Simple enough. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to change anything. Just anytime you're about to sit down in a chair, can you catch yourself and go, I'm about to sit down in a chair? And oftentimes what happens is I'll have a student come back to me the next week and go, yeah, I noticed maybe 30% of the times I was going to sit down in a chair. And the rest of the time I suddenly realized I was sitting down and I didn't stop to think about when it happened. And so that's kind of the process, is notice it, be able to stop and call it out before it happens. Because then you have created a little bit of space between the stimulus and the response that we were talking about. And at that point, that little bit of space you've created, you can then put in the third step, which Alexander calls direction. And direction is just the deciding what to do, deciding which course of action to take. Direction, Alexander used to refer to them as orders back in the beginning, and then decided that that was too harsh because direction is not, a restrictive thing. It's very much just, I'm making a choice and I'm doing it. And then going ahead to do it. So that's kind of big picture where the steps that people tend to go through. Again, it's always very individual. But I want to talk about a couple more principles that get touched on a lot in lessons that are kind of central to the technique. The first one is, I mentioned before, the idea that normal is what feels right. This is a thing that, again, Alexander uses big words. Alexander refers to this as faulty sensory appreciation. The idea behind that is just our sense of self is kind of calibrated based on what our habits are, based on what we're used to. And so anything other than that is going to be off in whatever sort of relative direction it is. An example of that is if you're the kind of person who has a stoop and maybe sits like this all the time, has a lot of this going on. Well, if you're in a lesson with me and I bring you up to what is objectively neutral, you're going to feel like you're falling backwards because for you, this is neutral. And so you've moved back quite a bit from where you're used to, and your sensations, your vestibular sensations are going to be screaming at you that you're falling backwards. But see, again, that's where the no judgment comes in. It's not right or wrong, it's just different. And you'll see there's a mirror behind me. I use a mirror in lessons often as a way to, you're not looking at the mirror the whole time, but I'll be moving you and I'll get you to a place that feels very different than what you're used to. And then I'll say, look in the mirror and tell me whether it feels different than it looks, because it oftentimes does. So that's something that we want to be aware of and be mindful of. The corollary to that is that because whatever you're used to is what feels right, whatever your habit is what feels right, if you want to make change, you need to be okay with being wrong for a while. You need to be okay with feeling wrong for a while, because you're not actually wrong, but that's how it will feel. One of my favorite books about the technique, which was actually written by a teacher for other teachers primarily, the title of the book is Dare to Be Wrong. And I love that because being wrong can be a very gutsy thing to do. There's this very, very tense societal pressure to be right all the time. Everybody doesn't, like, nobody wants to be caught being wrong. But you can't make change if you're not willing to feel at least a little bit wrong. And so, one second. Okay, come back later. Sorry about that. My 4-year-old wanted something. Hang on one second. I'm sorry about this.
It's okay, it happens to everyone.
Okay. But yeah, so you have to be willing to spend some time feeling like you're wrong, feeling like you're in a place that is not correct. And really it ties back into this idea that even right is kind of a fallacy. So there's a quote from Alexander: everyone wants to be right, but no one stops to think if their idea of right is right. And so we kind of work with that, you know, things aren't necessarily good or bad. They are more efficient, less efficient, more, you know, more beneficial in specific ways, appropriate to the situation versus not, that kind of thing. I teach a workshop for physical therapy college students every year, and it's geared towards them being able to work with musicians. And one of the things that we talk about a lot is that if you're a musician or an athlete or a performer or somebody who has this very, very finely honed skill, that might be tied into your physicality, in the sense that, you know, you get beautiful music at the piano, but only if you're hunched over like this. And, you know, maybe you want to come up, maybe you don't want to be hunched over like that, but maybe that's the only way to get the sound that you want. And so in that case, maybe you go ahead and let the playing be there, but then when you're not playing, you've learned how to come up and away from it so that you're not stuck there all the time. And so things like that, of like finding situationally appropriate ways of inhabiting yourself, ways of existing, that kind of break down that idea that there is a one right answer. It's also the reason that we tend to stay away from the word posture, because posture implies a static thing. It implies like that there is one set shape that you can find and then be good. And the human body is dynamic. It's designed to move. It's not a one size fits all thing. I much prefer the term poise, because it implies that there's movement happening, that it's a coordination is another word that gets used a lot. The idea is that as you're moving, all of your parts are moving coordinated in balance, as opposed to kind of being out of whack. So, you know, it's not about finding a specific position. It's about finding a state of coordination, or a state of functioning, as Alexander would say. And then that ties into the last principle that I want to talk about, which is actually a pair of vocabulary words. That's two sides of the coin. And again, this is Alexander speak. The two words are end gaining and means whereby. And so basically what this is, end gaining is thinking about what you want. Means whereby is thinking about how you get there. And so basically what he's saying is you want to focus on the means whereby, as opposed to becoming hyper-focused on that end, that goal, that thing that you want. You can't get there if you don't know where you are. So stopping to pay attention to where am I right now, and what's maybe the next step that will get me closer, you know, and focus on that. I heard it described at some point, and it stuck with me, that like you're at the end of a very long hallway, and at the other end of that hallway, on a Post-it note stuck on the wall, is your goal. And it's there, you can see it, but you can't read it from back here. And you certainly can't do anything about it from back here. So you've got to work on, where am I right now? And how do I get to the spot where I'm in a place to work on that? And so again, some people can feel like this is saying never have goals, and it's not. It's just asking you to be a little bit more mindful about how you're getting where you're going, and that it's not entirely about the thing at the end, it's about what you're doing on the way. And so I usually describe it simply as end gaining is about the what, and means whereby is about the how. And that's really what we're focusing on, is the how of getting there. Last thing I wanted to talk about briefly, which will tie into if anybody wants to come in for lessons, what actually happens in a lesson. So, like I said, all of this is philosophy. It does all have practical application. Basically, the way a lesson works is it's one-on-one, and the student will be kind of what I would call an active observer for most of it. The idea here is that you can only do what you are familiar with, what your habit is. And so to get around that, you're basically doing nothing. And I'm the one doing the techniques and kind of moving you around. So I will have hands on you and I'll be moving you around a little bit, kind of, again, giving you an experience of different ways of moving, different places of being. A lesson has basically 3 parts to it. The first part is chair work, which is actually the only thing that Alexander did himself, which involves you sitting in a chair. And I move you back and forth, and move you around a little bit, get you up, put you back down, moving you around in the chair a little bit. And the idea, again, is just how many options are there for, ways that you can be sitting upright in a chair, and which ones do you tend to gravitate towards? Where are the kind of imbalances that might be present, and where can, I tend to look at a student almost mechanically, like sort of a pulley system almost, if you think about it that way, and kind of figuring out, okay, where's the ballast off? Where do I need to, readjust the tension patterns a little bit to kind of bring everything back into a balanced, supported state. And oftentimes what it is tension patterns. This is not universal by any means, but for most people, a lot of this will manifest as excess tension that is built up in specific places. We all have a tendency to hang on for dear life, metaphorically, when we don't really need to. And so there'll be a lot of this kind of residual tension that's just been built up. And so a lot of what I'm looking for is, where is it congregating, and how do I sort of release some of that excess tension? The body wants to move in a way that is supported as a whole. And so get everything back into balance, it'll be supported, it'll be much easier, lighter feeling, taller feeling. These are all things that people like say at the end of a lesson that they feel taller, they feel lighter, they feel more easy. It's very individual, but that tends to be what it is we're sort of finding the way to support you, as a whole self. And then, so that's chair work. The second part of a lesson is table work, which is basically the same principles, but instead of sitting in a chair, you're lying down on a table. This is actually not something Alexander did. As I said, he just did chair work. His first group of teacher trainees developed table work as a way to work on each other while they were waiting for turns from him. And so it works with all the same principles. The main difference with table work is that because you're lying down, you are not spending, even if it's subconscious, spending any worry on staying upright, right? Because there is that subtle thing of like, oh, I could fall out of the chair, right? there's nowhere to go if you're on the table. So you can actually let go much more fully. And it's often, a favorite of new students because it's the easiest way to let go of all that built up tension is when you're lying down and you can just let go without worrying about falling over. But it's essentially the same idea. I put my hands on and I start, as my teacher would say, bringing about the lengthening and the widening of kind of getting the whole self back to a more balanced and supported state. And there's the moving around from one limb to the next and kind of doing piecemeal one at a time, and looking at, again, having gravity in a different orientation can sometimes help as well, especially if somebody's got like arm concerns. I might have them do some arm movements on the table because when gravity is sort of pulling you this way, it's easier to see how much effort is actually required for a lot of those things. And then the third part of a lesson with me is what I call application. It doesn't happen at every lesson, but it's always an option. And application is basically taking these techniques, these principles that we've been working with, and applying them to whatever specific area of concern you have. So if I'm working with a dancer, we might be looking at specific dance movements. If I'm working with, a musician, they might bring in their instrument and play a difficult passage for me so that I can see, what they might be doing that they can stop doing to make the passage easier. If I'm working with a singer, we might be talking about breath support and where to breathe in this passage and finding ways to work with, again, finding an efficient way of performing this thing that needs to be done without, screwing yourself up in the process. I even had a student once who was going to be in a wedding and was going to need to wear heels and never wore heels and wanted me to work on walking in heels with her for a couple of sessions. And we did that, and it can apply to pretty much anything that you might have or want to do. And it doesn't have to be just physical applications either. There are people who I've worked with on things like public speaking, like they're going to give a big presentation. I have a student right now who we end up talking a lot about emotional stuff, that she's going through a rough patch emotionally. And so we talk about, ways to apply the principles to kind of your emotional well-being as well. There's a lot of different ways to take it. And so I always save a little bit of time at the end of a lesson for, is there anything that you want to talk about or work on today? It doesn't, it's not an every lesson thing by any means, but it's always there. And most people will take me up on it at least a couple of times. So that's the idea behind that. There's a lot more I could get into, but that's the basic overview of kind of where the technique comes from, what the goals are, and how we go about them. I think, yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead. I was just going to add a couple questions before I would, turn the recorder off so that we can, have them ask questions. But
yeah,
two things, come to mind. So you're working with a lot of, obviously, I would think, cancer survivors and caregivers. How do you work with the cancer survivors, and what are their kind of needs that you address specifically for that population, I guess would be my first question.
It's really fascinating. The work that I've done with the clubhouse we end up talking a lot about kind of the mental side of things. But we talk about some physical stuff as well, but the conversations that always stick out to me that I remember are the ones that focus on the idea of sort of finding what your best is on any given day, because you might not always be at what you think of as your best. And so finding acknowledging that and making peace with that, and being sure that you are not getting in the way. You are not making this process any harder than it needs to be. And being honest with yourself. If it's, this week has been hard and I'm not able to do a lot of the things that I used to be able to do, that's fine. Let's find ways to still accomplish whatever you need to get accomplished that you can manage.
Mhm.
It's this idea of sort of meeting you where you are. A lot of the technique, especially the kind of self-reflection part of it that is on the student to do, is about understanding where you are and being able to acknowledge that without judgment, because we are all our worst critics. We are all the hardest on ourselves. And so being able to just, state objectively, this is what's going on, and move on from there in a way that is constructive, tends to be helpful for people.
And I like that because we, this group particularly, we've worked a lot and had a lot of speakers, including myself, even on self-care and self,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And that kind of goes along with that the philosophy that you're,
Mhm.
referring to through the Alexander technique is
Absolutely.
no judgment, right?
Mhm.
And looking at, excuse me, what you're able to do versus what you're not able to do, and how do we do that? How do you do that, right?
Exactly. And, even things like, I have heard from many a member that chemo sucks. I have heard from many a member that having a port here makes things complicated, little things that you can maybe do to sort of take back a little bit of control over how you react to things. Even if you felt like you didn't really have control over the things that happened that needed to be dealt with, that you can control how you react to them. And that can be really beneficial.
Right. And I always say respond, right? There's a difference between a reaction and a response. So, you think in terms of what you say is wonderful, that you learn how to respond to things instead of just reacting all the time, right? Big
Yeah.
difference. And how your mental connects to your body with that thought, right?
Exactly. And it can manifest in a whole bunch of different ways depending on the person. It could be that we mostly work on stress. It could be that we mostly work on, the physical side of things, of not tensing up around whatever the source of the pain is. Or I've worked with some members who had like nerve issues as a result of all of this. And so working with the idea of like, yeah, your sensory feedback is not necessarily accurate right now, and how do you deal with that? How do you sort of internalize that and make a conscious decision based on what you know to be true, as opposed to necessarily the feedback you're getting?
Right, right. I like what you said in the beginning when you also talked about, when people have problems with balance. I know, we work with Jeanette Poppenberg, who's an exercise physiologist. We talked about balance a couple months ago, and being thoughtful about, getting up and before you take that step, having the mind connection, not only the body connection, but the mind connection of thinking like, what do you need to do to be able to get from point A to point B, and being thoughtful. So I think this is obviously very helpful. The last question I have before I open up for questions is, do you require them to get a permission from a physician? Do you have a form for them to? Because I know when we've done Reiki or things like that, when we were at the Cancer Caring Center, we did have a release form from a physician just to protect you as well as them from anything going wrong. Do you guys have that?
I do not. When I give private lessons out of my house, and I have an intake form that just asks you to list any medical stuff that's going on, so that I'm aware of it.
Yeah.
Part of the idea behind the technique is that it is all based on things you will actually confront in your daily life, and so all of these movements are intended to be things that you can easily do. I'm not making anybody do cartwheels or anything like that. I'm just sort of moving you around a little bit, back and forth, most of it. And so it tends to be fairly low risk on that front, because it is so individual. It is really just a question of like, tell me, if you have any concerns or any things that you think might be an issue, bring them up ahead of time, and I can modify to suit most things. The port's actually a great example, because there's a couple of techniques that I do that would involve my hand being kind of right there, and I just modify and put my hand somewhere slightly off to the side. you
Right.
know.
Yeah, I'm thinking of that in like lymphedema or
Mhm.
mastectomies, where you
Yeah.
have incision sites or expanders or things like that.
Exactly.
So certainly
It-
that would be good for them to tell you and talk to you about all of that.
Exactly. And it's not a thing that I think rises to the level of like needing a waiver. It's just to tell me what it is, and none of it should hurt. If it starts to hurt, let me know and we will do something else. It's
Right.
like this shouldn't hurt. Stop me if it hurts and we'll do a different thing.
Absolutely. Makes sense. Makes sense. Okay, I'm going to stop and thank you. That this is fabulous, fabulous, wonderful information, something new and very practical and useful, which is important. All right, I'm going to